Hello and welcome to this episode of Mission Possible. I'm Parul Chandra and with me is Mr. Pinak Ranjan Chakravarty, former Indian High Commissioner to Bangladesh. And we're going to be talking to Mr. Chakravarty about some of the momentous events that he saw in Bangladesh while he was serving as India's envoy to India's neighboring country. Welcome to SNI, Mr. Chakravarty. You were the High Commissioner to Bangladesh between 2007 and 2009, and you began on a very eventful note. You had a caretaker government in place which was backed by the military. The parliamentary elections were postponed, and you told me that you had not even presented your credentials until then. So what was it like?
Well, the caretaker administration had taken over sometime in October of the previous year, 2006, as per the constitutional requirement. But there was a huge amount of wrangling and between the Awami League and the BNP. Both had to agree to a certain number of people in the caretaker administration and who would head it as chief advisor. They couldn't agree. So what happened was then there was the last option in the constitution was that in case there is no agreement, then the president himself will become the chief advisor and president all rolled into one, which is what happened.
Yes.
And which was not a very happy thing in terms of, so there were agitations, there were, the Awami League was agitating, people were killed on the streets, in police action, etc. And this continued till about January, when they could not decide on a common position or a common selection of who will be the chief advisor. And that is when I think the army moved in a very decisive manner. So that's what happened. I had joined the High Commission on the 7th of January. I had, of course, not presented my credential because it happened on the 11th of January, this whole army move that took place. And so then it was a strange situation that I could not meet anybody till I had presented credentials, which actually was on the 14th of January, after which I could become active.
And if I'm not mistaken, Ijazuddin Ahmed was the chief advisor.
That's right.
And he was replaced by Fakhruddin.
No. Ijazuddin Ahmed was the president.
Okay.
And as president, he was appointed by the previous BNP government. He was a mild-mannered academic who was basically appointed because he would be a rubber stamp for the BNP, and primarily Begum Khaleda's son Tariq, who was running the show from behind the scenes.
He's still running the show.
Well, he's now in exile, and he probably he can't even come back. Anyway, that's another story. But what happened was that they had a veteran, a founder of the BNP who was president. His name is Dr. Badruddin Chaudhary. He's a medical doctor, and he was a founder member of the BNP and was foreign minister actually when the BNP came to power in 2001. And so he fell out with Tariq Zia, who's the son of Khaleda Zia, and they forced him to resign. And he, of course, then left the BNP, formed another, and he's still there. In fact, the last election,
he was very
formed
active.
He was active.
Yes.
He formed a coalition with certain parties. He formed a party called Bikolpo Dhara in Bengali, which really means an alternative way. And Vikalp in Hindi we say. So anyway, he went out and he was a stalwart of the BNP. But it all happened because of the machinations of Tariq Zia, who was behind the scenes trying to do a lot of things and manipulating politics. He was, of course, a highly corrupt person also, which all came to light much later. And he was convicted. He was also convicted of organizing the grenade attack on Sheikh Hasina before that in 2008. So all these things happened after Hasina came back to power. But then at that time in January, of course, when the army moved in, they basically told the president that he will remain president, but there will be a new caretaker government, which was handpicked by the army actually. They had picked up people But they picked some good people, and there was no doubt that Dr. Fakhruddin Ahmed, a famous economist, a World Bank economist, was made the caretaker chief. One of their old diplomats, Iftikhar Ahmed, became the foreign advisor, etc. There were some other people also whom I knew. In fact, one of them was an old ambassador also.
So, what kind of impact did this have on the running of Bangladesh, where you had an army-backed government running the show, I think, for more than a year? And
more than that,
yes,
almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years. So, what kind of impact did it have? And also, what kind of impact did it have on you as the High Commissioner of India to Bangladesh? What was India's view, in fact, on this?
Well, I think at that time we took the view that we are not going to object to anything because the events were still unfolding. So there was a new caretaker government, which was as per the constitution. But then the caretaker government's period had lapsed, of 90 days. So what was really happening was technically unconstitutional.
Yes. So, but India did not say anything.
We didn't take a position on that. We actually met I went and met all of them and said, basically they said, because of these problems we were having, we had to take this step. They said that this was a force majeure in terms of that if things had gone normally, this wouldn't have happened. This is what the General Moiuddin Ahmed told me, others also.
He was the army chief?
He was the army chief and the kind of the power behind the caretaker administration. In the beginning, people actually welcomed it because all that wrangling and the fighting that was going on in the streets, politics there is very street oriented, like in many developing countries. So I think people actually thought that maybe this will give them a sense of respite and calm, etc., which is what happened. But then people started realizing that this was a bit unconstitutional, and one of the major issues that the Awami League was fighting about was to revision of the electoral rolls, which they felt had been manipulated to an extent
by the
BNP, and which ultimately turned out to be true what they did. Anyway, that is so. This is what was happening. So we had to deal with the caretaker administration and, of course, General Moiuddin Ahmed, who was really the power behind the throne.
So were you talking to General Ahmed regularly?
Yes. It's part of my job to go and talk to him regularly.
So were these like
because
behind the scenes kind of talks?
No, I used to go openly.
Obviously, he was not the head.
I should add here that he was also very keen to talk to me. It was not a one-way traffic, because he knew that India had a role to play, and he was looking for India's support, I think, to some extent, which we never overtly gave him.
But there was tacit support, really.
There was tacit support. Finally, when we got to know him and when we found that he was doing certain good things, despite all the unconstitutional and other aspects of it. But then he also did some negative things which didn't work out finally. But he did, one of the good things he did was revise the electoral roll. And that is when everybody discovered that more than 1.5 crores were bogus voters in this.
That's a huge number.
He did a very useful job of revising the electoral roll with photographs, and which was a really good electoral roll. And I remember he, in fact, told me and took me to see how it was being done in some of the villages around Dhaka. And I was impressed by the way they were handling it. The army, as usual, they hired people and they were sitting in with laptops, taking pictures of everybody, and so they did good. The thing that he tried to do was basically, and which backfired and didn't work, was to re-engineer the politics of Bangladesh. Because they said, look, these two begums, this Hasina and Khaleda, with these two around, it's a very divisive kind of politics that they do. But the point is, these two were the leaders of the two largest parties. So there was a formula that he felt that if I charge them with a lot of things and then get them out of the country in exile and finish them politically, then a new political setup can be minus these two. And he had got some support from the parties also, which other leaders of the party who he was trying to co-opt to to make sure that these two ladies are ousted from the political scene.
Well, he didn't succeed.
He called it a -2 formula.
Oh,
because the -2 of mine.
Yeah, the two Begums.
It finally didn't work, obviously, because these two ladies were the leaders of the party. Although he did get some collaboration, and he tried to put up various other candidates as new party, including Muhammad Yunus, the famous Nobel laureate.
Grameen Bank.
He in fact invited him to become the caretaker, chief advisor of the caretaker, but he had refused. But he did also, bite the bullet on setting up a political party, which didn't work because you can't organize a political party overnight.
As the High Commissioner, when these events were happening, were you concerned that the army might actually take over the reins of government in Bangladesh?
That was always a possibility, but I remember that he was not very keen to do that. He felt that having the facade of the caretaker administration gave him some kind of immunity in terms of, or gave him some protection.
And credibility, perhaps.
And credibility. But there was no doubt that he was running the show. I mean, he was going after some of the things which people liked was that he was putting a lot of corrupt people, known corrupt people in jail among politicians, among many of these guys fled actually the country and they stayed abroad till things had settled down. So I think those are the kind of things were happening. He wanted to clean up the system. His motives were not bad.
Okay.
I mean, his motives were not bad. Then, of course, we realized that that his motives were not bad. And then we reached out to him and we did, I think, establish a good rapport with him. And to an extent that he would call me and said, please feel free to come and meet me and discuss anything you want, or I can be of any help, etc. Which was a very nice gesture. And I utilized it to meet him quite often and separately from anything else. And we discussed a lot of things.
But India
had an advantage.
India really had no role to play in having this caretaker government in place backed by the army, because India's always been seen as a big brother in Bangladesh.
We didn't have a role to play, but we certainly tried to influence events after that. That in the sense that one example I can give you without revealing too many secrets, I think.
You may as well now.
No, well, I am sworn by a certain code of the government that I can't. So, for example, but it was done in a very persuasive manner, not in any other way. But basically by reaching out to General Ahmed and trying to reason with him, basically, that, trying to persuade him that, look, you've tried to do all this political engineering and it's not working. I think he also started realizing.
You may as well have elections.
The kind of nudging we were doing is that, why don't you have election? Clean up the voters list if you want. You will leave a good voters list and people will be happy and they will remember you for this.
And that finally happened
finally we moved on
2008.
Yes, end of 2000, November, I think. Yeah. And finally we also told him, look, your political engineering is not going to work. I think this was the message that we gave him. Others also might have given the same message. So, in fact, one day he asked me that, what do you think we should do? In that sense. I said, look, I am nobody to advise you. But since you asked...
You were being modest.
Well, no. I'm nobody to advise you, but particularly on your internal kind of things. So he said, no, High Commissioner, I would be happy to hear you. He was a very nice, interlocutor that way. And my greatest advantage was that I spoke to him in Bengali, which he liked and was comfortable. And but his mindset was also different from other generals that I had met earlier. And one day he did tell me that, High Commissioner, I was the first in my batch in the Bangladesh Military Academy. In other words, he was trying to tell me that, look, I wasn't trained in Pakistan. Because most of the other senior generals were Pakistan trained or were freedom fighters who were inducted into the army and rose to become generals. So that's the point he made, that whatever I am doing is interest in my country, and I have no personal interest. If I had a personal interest, I would have easily walked in and taken over the country and become president myself. I didn't do that. I found there was an element of sincerity in his demeanor and his actions. So basically we told him, look, your political engineering will probably not work out, so you have to think of alternatives. So he said, what alternative? I said, you allow the normal political process in the country to start. And then you can have elections. I mean, that is the best way, exit route for in this situation.
Ambassador Chakravarty, now that you're taking this trip down memory lane, let me take you back to another momentous event that occurred during your tenure as India's High Commissioner to Bangladesh. This happened in 2009 when the Bangladesh Rifles men were mutinied. And of course, now it's been renamed Bangladesh Guards after this revolt. But what happened? How did you learn of this incident?
Well, we got phone calls and from people whom we knew who were living in that area. In fact, the High Commission earlier was located very close to the BDR where in Dhanmondi. And we still had a cultural office there, and so our people were there, and they informed us that something is happening here, and there's been shooting, we could hear shots, etc. So I then put out told my people to find out what was happening, and we soon came to know that. Now, normally the press was there, they were also reporting that there's been some problem in the BDR complex. And finally, it slowly started leaking out that there's been shooting, there's been killings, etc.
Yes, the chief of Bangladesh Rifles was...
Oh yes, General Shakil Ahmed, whom I knew personally very well.
His wife was killed.
His wife too, I think Nazneen.
74
about
people were
about
dead.
70 odd army officers were killed, and there were several others also.
I think over 100 were
they were killed and
injured.
There were several reasons that took place, but I think, and it happened also because I think Sheikh Hasina had taken over as Prime Minister in January. So a lot of people suspected that this was being engineered by the BNP, the Jamaat and others who were sort of, who lost out in the election very badly, and having been in power. It was also rumored that the Jamaat had recruited many of their own people into the BDR, and some of them were involved in it. Anyway, all these rumors were floating around, and this was happening. And but finally, Sheikh Hasina and at that time Sahara Khatun, the Home Minister, played a very important role.
But she got some amount of flack also.
She did get some amount of flack, but they were...
the BDR came under her.
Yeah. They used a carrot and stick policy, which was, she came under flag because the BDR reported to the Home Ministry. It's like our...
it's like a paramilitary forces, like
our
CRPF
BSF.
or BSF, yes.
Then what happened was that she went there and tried to talk to some of these people who came to the gate, some of the mutineers who were armed. But she was very brave. She went there and talked to them and says, look, but to make sure that they understood that if they don't cooperate, there would be further bloodshed and they will all perhaps be killed, they moved in the army, and they deployed the army very visibly so that they could see, the mutineers could see.
Yeah, there were tanks
there were tanks on the streets
of
yes,
Dhaka.
Yes, absolutely. And so they were all there, they had surrounded the place, and after that some of them got scared, some of them tried to flee in civilian clothes, etc. Because I think during this time, not all of them participated. It was a huge complex.
But a huge number. I
but
believe
some of them
that
were
the mutiny had spread to some other Bangladeshi cities as well.
Worryingly, it had spread to some other BDR stations all over the country. I think almost 12 or 14 of them. And so, but the army then was ordered to move in and sort of neutralize some of these people. And then finally, you see, there were two aspects. One, of course, was the mutiny, how to finish it. The other was, which followed, was the anger in the army itself. That so many of our young officers and generals have been killed.
But
and
what about
so Sheikh
the
Hasina
anger?
was forced to go to the cantonment to address the army officers and saying, to say that it was very sad what had happened, etc. The reasons were, of course, many, and if you want to know, then I can get
Yes. You see, wasn't there also resentment? You talked about anger within the ranks of the army because so many of the officers had been killed. But what about the growing resentment amongst the ranks of the BDR? That is possibly what had led to this mutiny. They were unhappy about not getting promotions, they were unhappy about their rations, there was corruption. So all these issues perhaps were not addressed adequately enough by the Sheikh Hasina government, which led to...
Well, the Sheikh Hasina government had come in only in January, and this happened in February, end of February. You are right that there was resentment brewing, and which they should have, neutralized to some extent, but they didn't, or they couldn't fathom that this would happen to reach this stage. They were actually having their annual day when everybody was there, the sector commanders were there, and some people had come in from other stations also. And during that time, some of the Jawans started shouting in this meeting itself when the DG, General Ahmed, Shakil Ahmed was speaking.
Yes.
And that's when they pulled out some of the arms. There were some people outside. They raided the armory. They took out the arms.
And they just shot the General.
And they lined up some of these officers and just shot them. And then they buried them also in some shallow grave, etc. Anyway, these were all discovered later. But the resentment was about several things. One was that they felt that there was a program of ration, dal, bhat, etc. for their families, which they blamed the officers for not implementing and siphoning off the money. There was also some rumors about, sharing of money gathered from the smugglers. After all, BDR guards the borders. They make money out of the smugglers. There's no doubt about it. And there was some problem about sharing of that money. There was another more, professional anger at why should the BDR be officered by the army alone?
Yes.
And why should the army officers be on the top positions? Why not BDR officers and others who were direct recruits? Why
were they not made officers?
Why they are not? Yes. So all these things all added to a toxic sort of obviously a mix, which just burst on that day. Maybe they were waiting for this day because then everybody would be there. So they took advantage of the fact that all the sector commanders were there. Everybody was
I believe a number of them were also shot dead.
I think almost all the sector commanders were killed. Those who commanded sectors along the border. There were 16 of them, I think, and they were all shot dead.
We are running out of time, but one final question is, you were the High Commissioner. So what kind of reports were you sending back home? Was India worried about this? Did it think that this would unsettle the Sheikh Hasina government? What was India's response?
That was certainly a worry. In fact, one worry was that whether this was part of any larger conspiracy which might affect Sheikh Hasina herself. In fact, we were worried about her own safety also. But then we slowly found out through our contacts and sources that that was not the case. And advice was being given to Sheikh Hasina and others through our channels and other channels. And,
on how to deal with the situation?
Well, we were constantly asking, monitoring, what is it, do you need any help, etc. and things like that. And so we were ready to help in case they wanted it. But I think she moved very smartly and finally diffused the situation, and they got all of them to surrender. Some fled, who were later captured, and of course, then there were trials, etc., which ended in certain convictions, death sentences of quite a few people. I'm not sure whether these have been 152 odd people were sentenced to death, which was upheld by the High Court. But it was a tragic event, and it led to a lot of bloodshed, and it led to some, I would say, horrible cases where 50 of these mutineers died in custody because they were obviously beaten up, tortured, etc. Because there was a lot of anger against these people. So it was a bad episode, and of course it led to the reorganization of the BDR. Even though they changed the name also.
Yes.
They now call it border guards.
Border guards, yes.
So this is what happened. It happens in Bangladesh's history, a lot of such bloody incidents. Yes. So I think one has to now look back, but fortunately now we've had successful elections, 3 elections.
Yes.
Sheikh Hasina is now in her third term. So I don't anticipate any such problem in the future.
On that note, thank you so much, Ambassador Chakravarty, for talking to SNI.
Thank you very much.